Which size guitar strings should you use? Is it time for you to change your guitar strings? If so, you might be wondering what type of guitar strings you should buy. I'm here today to shed some light on the subject for you and offer my opinions based on your particular situation. First, let's go over the basics. When you read the size of a set of guitar strings, it will tell you the width of the high E string in thousandths of an inch. For example, size 10 strings would read 0.010, or size 9 strings would read 0.009. The string packages usually list the sizes of each string in the set. Of course, the strings get gradually thicker as you go from the high E to the low E string. For electric guitars, you generally have sizes 8 through 13. For acoustic, they have basically size 10 through 13. So let's go over some pros and cons of using thicker or thinner strings. Pros of thin strings: easy to play, easy to bend. So they're especially good for lead guitar. Cons of thin strings: weaker sound, especially for clean tones. Strings are easier to break, and the strings tend to have a shorter life. Now the pros of thick strings: fatter tone, especially for clean sounds, but really for anything. They're louder, they're less likely to break, and the strings tend to have a longer life. Cons of thick strings: they're harder to play and harder to bend, so potentially not as ideal for lead guitar. When I recommend new strings to beginner guitar players, I typically will suggest lighter strings, because when you're learning guitar, having a guitar that's easy to play is essential. And if you're fighting with the guitar, then you'll get frustrated, so you want it to be as easy as possible. If you're a beginner electric guitar player, I would suggest using size 9 strings. In my opinion, size 8 strings are just too thin. It's unnecessarily thin. And when you're learning, the tone is not as important as learning the right techniques and just how to place your fingers. And to make it easy, size 9 for electric, I think, is good. It's easy to play the right techniques on light strings. And I kind of think of it like this: learning on lighter strings is like using a wiffle bat before you start to use a baseball bat. That's not to say that they're not professional too. Lots of shredders, such as Eddie Van Halen, Steve Vai, and Joe Satriani, use size 9 strings. If you ever see them just going crazy, they're able to do it because they're so easy to play. If you gave them size 13 strings, they would not be able to play the way that they do. And another pro is you can bend the notes really far on these light strings. These players that I'm talking about are almost always using distortion or overdrive or whatever, so it does a nice job of masking the weaker tone of the light strings. Okay, if you're a beginner acoustic guitarist, I would suggest starting with size 11 strings. You might be able to find size 10 acoustic strings. They're harder to find, but same thing I said about the size 8s on electric. I think size 10 for acoustic is just unnecessarily thin. The sound is too puny, in my opinion. And you can't mask the sound of the acoustic strings with distortion like you can for electric, so the tone matters a little bit more for acoustic because that's all you're going to hear, you know. But size 11s are still pretty easy to play. It almost feels like 10s on an electric. Okay, I'm going to share with you 5 more things to consider. Number 1, if you tune your guitar to tuning lower than standard tuning, you'll want to increase your string gauge to compensate. For example, size 10 strings tuned down to E flat will feel more like size 9 strings. Lower tunings are very common for things like metal and sometimes rock music. And if you go really low, like for metal tunings like D standard or C standard or something, you might even want to go experiment with size 11, 12, or even 13 strings, depending how low you tune. The second thing to consider: if you play mostly clean electric guitar stuff, you'll want to use a little bit thicker strings, such as 10 or 11. Size 8 and 9 strings are too puny for clean guitar tones, in my opinion. The tone of the strings is going to matter more when you take away the distortion. Plus, it won't be that bad if you're not bending a lot of notes. If you're just playing chords like power chords and strumming and stuff, then you'll be able to handle it and you'll appreciate the better tone of the thicker strings. Number 3, if you're more of a rhythm guitarist and you aren't doing too much bending, I would go with pretty thick strings. Size 12 for acoustic is basically the standard, I find. Sizes 10 through 12 would all work for electric rhythm players. The bigger the strings, the bigger the tone, and the louder your guitar will be. Number 4, if you're a beast and have really strong hands, you could try just muscling through the really thick size 13 strings, even for lead guitar. So the blues guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan, he bent the crap out of his strings, and he was using size 13. I think he's tuned down a half step, but still takes a strong hand. The ability to solo like crazy while having monster tone is obviously the best of both worlds, so if you can do it, then all the power to you. One more thing to consider too, the 5th one. If you're experimenting with changing your string gauge from what you have now, I would recommend only going up or down 1 gauge. Also, if you're changing the gauges, you're going to want to set your guitar up again because it'll change the tension on the neck. The tension of the strings could cause your neck to bow more or less than it was before. And even changing your string gauge 1 size can actually make a pretty big difference. I wouldn't go from, say, size 9s to 12s, but it'd go from 9 to 10 or 11 to 10 or whatever. Just don't make too big of jumps because it's might be a bigger difference than you think. So I've been playing guitar for most of my life now, and I've experimented with a lot of different string sizes over the years. For electric guitar, I've basically landed on size 10s for all uses. By the way, I play standard tuning most of the time and occasionally a half step down, and in both situations, the 10s are good, I think. I feel like the tone is good with 10s, and I can still solo and play stuff pretty easily. Yes, there's a little resistance when bending the strings, but I like a little bit of resistance. A little resistance I think is good. Every once in a while I go back to size 9s. When I do that, I realize why I don't use them anymore. I'm glad that I learned on 9s because they really do make things easy. And if I was playing strictly rock or metal gigs and standard tuning and I was always using distortion, then I would use size 9s easy all day. So if that's you, then I would suggest that. If you're playing all rock and metal where it's distortion all the time and you're not really doing clean sounds, then you got nothing to lose by going with the light ones that are easy to play. One time I tried using size 13s on my telly, and it was an interesting experiment. For one, I had to set my guitar up a bit differently. The strings also took some time to wiggle into the nut properly. First off, the tone was awesome with the 13s, but it was quite a bit tougher to play lead guitar on. I could do it, but it really fights back. If I was strictly a rhythm guitar player, then I might go with that. Let's say you were the Malcolm Young in an AC/DC tribute band. Size 13s would probably do you well. For acoustic guitar, I basically have developed a system. I'll use size 11s for gigs and size 12s if I'm recording in the studio. As someone who plays a lot of acoustic gigs these days, the size 11s are just a little easier on my fingers. Like, I was getting some pain in a couple fingers maybe halfway through the gig, or one finger, one spot in particular. Ever since I switched down to the 11s, I haven't really gotten that less pain in the hands. It wasn't that bad, but if it's easy to play, then it'll do you good. But for recording in the studio, size 12s is a good one, or even 13s too. So if you were like strictly a acoustic studio musician, I'd go 12 or 13s. These are my suggestions. Only you can really decide what's best for you. Try a few things out and see what you like. But I hope I helped you to gauge your situation a little better. There is kind of a science to it. It's an art and a science. Let me know what kind of strings you use in the comments and what you play, electric, acoustic, or what styles of music you play, metal, whatever, pop, country. And if you want me to discuss anything else soon, please let me know down below. And thank you everyone for subscribing. Please subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next video.